Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Crushes Religious Freedom. I am also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and RU CSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights Podcast informative, please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. Today's episode is entitled Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, featuring Dr. Lara Sheehi, who discusses her book by the same name. She explores the concept of sumud, psychological resilience and defiance, within the context of occupation and settler colonialism in Palestine. Dr. Sheehi delves into the deep psychological expressions of individual and collective endurance through the lens of psychoanalysis. With powerful clinical case studies, Dr. Sheehi sheds light on how Palestinian clinicians and communities navigate lives marked by violence and oppression while resisting reduction to mere victims within the framework of human rights discourse. At a time when 2 million Palestinians in Gaza are being systematically killed, starved, and maimed by Israel, while funded by the United States government, Dr. Sheehi's research exposes the deep trauma that will shape generations of Palestinians to come. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic that is top of mind for a growing number of Americans opposed to the genocide in Gaza.
Thank you so much, Sahar. مساء الخير للكل وشكرا كثير على وجودكم. So, of course, I want to say a big thank you to Sahar Aziz and the Center for Security, Race and Rights. And thank you, of course, to the labor it took to bring this series together. I've given a version of this talk before. It takes up themes in the book that I co-wrote with my partner, Sheehi, and at other times, but right now especially, it's impossible to give this talk without centering and reminding us how settler colonialism, and in this case particularly Zionist settler colonialism, is a structure that is the provocation. And of course, I am saying this using and sort of riffing off of a lot of the loaded language that we have heard that sort of says that all this happened without provocation. So I'd like to name that settler colonialism is the provocation. Settler colonialism is a violent structure. It's a structure of power constitutively intending to harm. That is, it's organized around the logic of domination, exploitation, and racial and ethnic hierarchies. The structure of settler colonialism necessitates a persistent repetition compulsion of harmful practices that displace indigenous life, intrudes on physical and psychic sovereignty, and physically maims or creates debility, as Jasper Boire has taught us. The repetition compulsion is key, and yet, unlike its Freudian origins, is not unconscious, but rather pointed, purposeful, and shored up by the juridical, the social, the political, the economic, and the relational processes and structures. And I know Sahar has spoken about this, as has Noura Arakat, of course. The settler colonial repetition compulsion is organized around a constellation of actions that aim to make the settler native, as Patrick Wolf has taught us, and to invade the psychic province of being. While settler colonialism relies on structures and acts of violence as its primary function, its hegemony legitimizes this violence through the valiance of virtues. This is what we're seeing right now in real time, and which is why I'm fronting the talk with this sort of entry point. And this is often done, of course, through mission civilisatrice, or spreading democratic values, relying on moralism and codes of civility, indicative of what Heike Schotten highlights as, quote, settler colonial eliminationist ideology, end quote. The codes are therefore inherently ideological, and they contour, among other things, Who has permission to speak about what, and most importantly, how that speech is delivered, especially in the case of Palestine vis-a-vis Zionism. For Schotten, this ideology is constructed in an unmarked matrix of savage versus civilized. Again, this is right underneath our noses right now, in which, quote, settler colonial ideology smuggles a highly normative value system into the polity, whereby only settler life qualifies or is properly recognized as life itself, simultaneously constructing its opposite, that which refuses life in an unthinkable or utterly unconscionable manner. Life here comes to represent normative being, a nod to Sylvia Wynter's ethnoclass of man, and the referential point, which the normative boundaries of existence, and therefore who threatens that existence, are constituted. This is what we're witnessing today, in real time, in Palestine, in Gaza. And in the midst of that, because my talk is about our book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, and because I'm a psychoanalytically oriented clinician and professor, I'd like to read for you to hold in mind for the case that I'll be presenting from Palestine about what the World Association of Psychoanalysis released on October 8th from Paris. And these are their words. This is a communiqué by the World Association of Psychoanalysis. Quote, the World Association of Psychoanalysis, through the voice of its president and its international council, affirms its total solidarity with the Israeli people, victims of massacres of civilians on a mass scale, accompanied by the kidnapping of women and children held hostage. Irrespective of any political context, these practices are indisputably terrorist in nature and amount to crimes against humanity. It is therefore our duty to condemn here and now, without any yes but, the Hamas organizations responsible for the execution, if not the conception, of this infamous plan. Our thoughts are with our Israeli colleagues, members of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, and the New Lacanian Society, and we send them our unconditional support in the ordeal their country is going through. Elsewhere, Stephen and I have noted that far before the global transformation of Islamophobia as a blatantly racist discourse into a sanctioned political analysis, Derrida approached the global reach and relevance of psychoanalysis very carefully, understanding how its deployment, quote, may serve as a conduit for these new forms of violence. He warns that psychoanalysis, quote, is in danger of becoming nothing more than a perverse and sophisticated appropriation of violence, or at best, merely a new weapon in the symbolic arsenal, end quote. Derrida's remarks were made in reference to the recently ratified constitution of the International Psychoanalytic Association, which made a similar statement of this nature that I read, where the association's geographical areas were defined at that time as North America, north of the United States-Mexican border, all America south of that border, and, quote, the rest of the world, which Derrida remarked, quote, connotes all that virgin psychoanalysis, to put it bluntly, has never set foot in, end quote. The rest of the world in the IPA's constitution, Derrida observes, is, quote, thus a title, name, and location that lies beyond the boundaries of psychoanalysis, which has yet to be opened. It therefore is a foreign body named, incorporated, and circumscribed ahead of time by an IPA constitution rehearsing, as it were, the psychoanalytic colonization of a non-American rest of the world, the conquest of a virginity parenthetically married to Europe, end quote. Rather than releasing Derrida from the sexist and cis-heteronormative metaphor that he instrumentalizes, I'm thinking about for a moment to think that this formulation is precisely to a particular form of normative reproduction of psychoanalytic theory, which I'll go into a little bit more with the specifics in the context of Palestine. Derrida identifies psychoanalysis as invasive. It has a missionary repetition compulsion, one that aims to colonize the bodies of others in order to establish sovereignty over the universality of the psyche. What's important for our talk today here is that the IPA's constitution, of which Derrida was pointing to, was ratified in Jerusalem in 1977 a city under internationally recognized occupation. This makes us consider then that even which foreign bodies become identifiable, categorizable, and recognizable, let alone worthy of receiving the conquest of psychoanalysis. Of course, readily imagining and disimagining who psychoanalysis is worthy to treat. I give my talk then in this context as what's unfolding in Palestine and the sordid history that psychoanalysis has in the colonizing and settler colonial project. I'll introduce my talk, why it's important in the current sociopolitical moment, and then most importantly, I will uplift the words of a Palestinian clinician with whom I've worked alongside and who Stephen and I document in our book. Some of you might have heard parts of this through other talks or have read the book yourself, but I'm hopeful that we can still find something new that emerges in our communal space together. And I would really hope that you hold in mind what's happening right now as I read the words and sort of relate to you the story from Palestine. So in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon in his characteristically unrelenting clarity states, quote, "In this work, I have made it a point to convey the misery of the Black man, physically and affectively. I've not wished to be objective. Besides, that would be dishonest. It's not possible for me to be objective," end quote. Likewise, for me, it's not possible for me to be objective. This acknowledgement of lack of objectivity, far from being enough to counter the ongoing wrecking effects of settler colonialism, is for our purposes today understood as a small and necessary act of reclaiming disavowed truths, as well as attending to the textured violence of racial history in the United States settler colony, as well as a settler colony of the state now known as Israel. Truths and history that through innocence, especially as articulated by Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang, conveniently become displaced and disappeared. This disappearance, a disavowal in psychoanalytic terms, maintains a particular social order while hiding the mechanisms by which that order is maintained. The act of reclaiming disavowed truths and unabashedly naming them as such is the method by which I heed Fanon's call and attempt to counter in real time the perniciousness of what Stephen and I have come to understand as psychoanalytic innocence, which I'll speak to a little later. Objectivity, as it's encoded into psychoanalysis, of which neutrality is a subset, is one such valve of innocence, something that Fanon very early on was working to shift in psychoanalysis to include a sustained engagement with sociogeny and then, of course, the revolutionary struggle for liberation. This framework, as I've come to understand and practice it, has at its core a militant disruption of the violence done by seemingly innocent psychoanalytic praxis and theory, heeding the call to practice what Glenn Coulthard in Red Skin, White Masks has termed, quote, "a politicized anger and a disciplined maintenance of resentment," end quote. Not as a deflection from the depth work of psychoanalysis, but rather as a contingency for vibrant livability in the face of oppressive structures, as my Palestinian scholar and sister and comrade Nadira Shalhoub Kavrukian reminds us. And I'd like us to think about this life and livability in juxtaposition to what Heike Schoten has told us about who comes to live life and who, of course, is sort of doesn't hold life dear. Again, something we're seeing in real time unfold. It's fitting then and talk about psychoanalysis under occupation, especially with the settler colonial condition in Palestine, that I reject objectivity and embrace the Fanonian methodology of militancy in speaking to Palestinian presence, sumud or stalwartness in the face of Zionist violence. In this way, I myself refuse to collude with psychoanalytic innocence. The concept of psychoanalytic innocence emerges from our book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. While the concept underlines its ubiquity in the field of psychoanalysis, as you just heard from the two statements that I read, the book, we used it to discuss the way psychoanalytic theory and practice can work in service of violence in the context of the settler colonial condition in Palestine. For example, we attend to how ideologically psychoanalysis insists on dialogue, reason, and working through without a sustained analysis of the material conditions of dispossession in Palestine and acts under the pretense not only of neutrality and objectivity, but also universalism, empathy as an endpoint of process, and the myth of safety. We name how in this context, psychoanalytic innocence works in concert with the logics of settler colonialism and occupation, denying the everyday violence enacted on Palestinians and conveniently forgetting how this is also structured by the unconscious. Deployed in this way, psychoanalytic innocence is particularly insidious because it simultaneously forfeits psychoanalysis' supposition of unconscious process and structure while also ignoring material reality. Psychoanalytic innocence is not understood as an intrapsychic process. It doesn't happen just inside that disrupts the analyst's thinking, but rather as an innocence that pervades the ideological position of the practice, the theory, and therefore the relational space of psychoanalysis. That is why in the book and here today, I want to center the work and practice of sumud and resistance by our clinician colleague who generously shared of herself just like others did in the book. As in other examples of the book, the clinical case I'm platforming today is a jumping off point. Rather than engaging in a maneuver of psychoanalytic innocence where the content alone comes to hold the energetic pull of clinical attention, I want us to focus on how the clinical work that Yoad does comes to be both a space for resistance for her patients and also an extension of her own resistance against settler colonial hegemony. Indeed, what we consistently came upon in our work alongside our colleagues was that a collective practice is unified through precisely this engagement with creating and maintaining life and life worlds, counter to everything that we've been hearing about the deathscape that is planted by Palestinians. It's about creating life, as well as political and historical realities for Palestinians by Palestinians. So the following clinical example was shared with us by Yoad Ghanadri Hakim, a brilliant clinician and a revolutionary soul with captive citizenship in the Zionist state. After meeting Yoad, we continued to have conversations with her and witnessed her speaking publicly and in psychoanalytic groups over subsequent years, conversations that only increased our admiration for her critical insights and her depths of empathy. One particular case she shared with us is that of Amjad, a man in his early 30s who worked in an Israeli textile company inside the 1948 borders of the state now known as Israel. Though he had a home in the West Bank, Amjad, along with his 3 children and wife, who was a homemaker, rented a house in an officially annexed village near Kalandia out of fear of losing his, quote, identity card that allowed him to live and work in Jerusalem. Amjad visited the clinic where Yoad worked as he suffered from sensations of a lump or a ball in his throat whenever he became nervous. Amjad had undergone many medical tests to establish treatment for what he felt was a medical condition, though each medical consultation indicated that his throat was, quote, 100% normal. After a year, one of Amjad's physicians suggested he seek help from a psychologist. He was initially very embarrassed in the clinical space with Yoad and found difficulty speaking about himself, as well as anything beyond what he felt must be a medical condition. He explained that there were days when he felt the ball in his throat was getting bigger, while other days he felt it getting smaller. Yoad asked him to share with her his reflections and observations about what sometimes made the pain increase to such a degree he was barely able to speak. He would tell her, quote, "My words stop in my throat. They knot up and become a ball in my throat. They suffocate me when they do not come out." End quote. Amjad was annoyed with himself. She also, and Yoad, felt the ball move from his throat into her stomach, a knot she could not release. Amjad's therapy with Yoad lasted approximately 1.5 years of weekly sessions. She reported initially having been supervised by an Israeli Jewish psychologist. Yoad noted that while the lore of the institution at which she worked was such that everyone held themselves to professional standards and believed in the fundamental premise of psychoanalytic theory and practice, she often sensed this collapse of psychic space when her Israeli supervisors, especially in the case of Amjad, tried to theorize Palestinian patients seen by Palestinian clinicians. In the case of Amjad, rather than being curious about the psychoanalytic meanings of Amjad's symptoms, the supervisor insisted that Amjad suffered from a behavioral anxiety disorder and that only medication could solve his problem. Yoad felt deeply conflicted by this assessment as she relayed her attuned clinical intuition that Amjad likely had much more to say. She feared that medicine would potentially preemptively shut Amjad and his exploratory process down and foreclose opportunities to collaboratively read the symptoms as signs of a deeper communication about his experience and being. Yuad recalled disagreeing with her supervisor openly, despite being painfully aware of the power differential and the potential implications of doing so. She insisted that she should continue to be curious with Amjad about what he was trying to communicate in the displacement, in countertransference, and in the dyad, even if this was not explicitly articulated. This, of course, represented an alignment with a psychoanalytic tradition and technique in which she and her supervisor were trained. Despite this, her supervisor insisted on psychiatric intervention, and therefore Yuad suggested that Amjad consult a psychiatrist, an intervention that pacified her supervisor, but which Amjad refused. Yuad often also had the feeling of the room being heavy with thoughts and words that were left unsaid, though they were very much present. In this, she reflected how both silence and speech can be defensive, used to fill up the space, but never reaching the depths of the patient or the clinician. Her supervisor dismissed concerns that Yuad brought up, her countertransference, and her concern that the ball in Amjad's throat lightened as he spoke, but immediately returned and grew whenever the session ended. She felt that she and Amjad were playing a game of negotiation, and yet in reality, there was no solution. Yuad was confronted with conflicts regarding how to speak about the work with Amjad in supervision. She noted the psychoanalytic importance of having associated to negotiations, especially in the context of Palestine. While she understood intuitively that associations had meaning, especially in the countertransference, Yuad found herself at a loss of how to express this concern to her supervisor, especially as the supervisor did not share Yuad's concerns. Amjad himself was happy that he did not feel any discomfort in his throat during the sessions. However, he stated that outside the clinic, his painful feelings returned and he was unable to get rid of the ball. Yuad asked him to put aside the distracting notes he had taken to bringing into session and talk about his difficulty breathing in real time, with specific focus on when he was feeling suffocated. He told her that his feeling of suffocation increases, and when it increases, it turns into a ball in his throat that suffocates him fully. Yuad worked with Amjad to uncover and recount all the moments in which he had felt suffocated. When his wife reminding him of payments for the pathetic car he had bought, when he passed in front of his closed house in the West Bank, when his Israeli boss asked him to bring him fresh olive oil from their tree in the West Bank, when he entered the area controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and he read the sign, "No crossing border, dangerous area." In every session after that pivotal moment, Amjad talked about the specifics of his breathing difficulties and sighed a lot as he did so. At this point, her supervisor indicated abruptly that it was time for Yuad to end Amjad's treatment because she was happy with the achievement he had made and felt there was no further growth or depth to explore. Yuad remembered feeling very upset about this decision, especially as she had just started to experience an important affective shift in the room. Because in the moment she felt she did not have the power to do otherwise, she initially followed her supervisor's advice and told Amjad that they needed to end their therapy. She recounted how Amjad exploded, shouting in a way that she could never have previously imagined from this soft-spoken man. While yelling, Amjad told her that she was weak and that, quote, she was not the one who owns the decision or the decision-making process, accusing her of, quote, not really being concerned with taking care of and protecting sick people, end quote. Yuad remembers being shocked by the fact that he was screaming, and yet she did not fully understand what was happening, nor did she have the space to reflect fully about her countertransference. But one thing that she remembers feeling is that she felt very happy. She felt happy that he was finding voice. After this moment, Yuad made the decision to continue Amjad's treatment alone without consulting her supervisor any further. During this phase of treatment, Amjad started talking about anger. More specifically, he spoke about getting angry inside his car, the lousy car in which he crossed the Kalandia checkpoint twice a day, once on his way to work and once on his way back. Amjad reported getting angry in his car whenever he read the word Ma'bar, checkpoint crossing, on a sign. He reported feeling angry because he did not feel like he was just crossing from one area to another, Rather, he felt that he was inside one space, but was prohibited from free movement in another while standing at a checkpoint. This is Amjad. Why do they call it a crossing? This is a checkpoint. A checkpoint. It's a checkpoint. In a session soon after he began to uncover his anger, Yoad reminded him that they had not spoken about the ball in his throat for quite some time now, inquiring where it was and if it remained a symptom for him. She recalled Amjad stating, quote, "Sometimes I feel that there is hate or hatefulness in my throat, and not a ball." This is when Yoad decided to ask him who he hated, to which he responded, "I hate myself." After a moment of silence, Yoad said Amjad opened up about an incident that had happened 2 years prior. He reported taking his 7-year-old daughter in the morning with him on his way to work, as she'd wanted to meet with a friend in Jerusalem. He remembered that his daughter was very happy that morning, as she'd been fantasizing about this magical day with her friend for quite some time. He recalled that she wore a beautiful new dress the night before out of excitement and put flowers in her hair the morning they set out. Amjad further shared that his daughter was singing throughout the trip in the car, in Arabic, but I'm translating it, "Bouncy, bouncy, bouncy ball, bouncy, bouncy over the wall." When they reached the Kalandia checkpoint, Amjad was surprised to see a tear gas and a confrontation between the occupation army and protesters. Worried about his daughter, he tried to reverse, but his car was stuck in the midst of hundreds of cars, all trapped, motionless. The situation was increasingly frightful for about 15 minutes, after which it completely calmed down, but the occupation soldiers closed the checkpoint and prevented the cars from moving. Amjad recalled that his daughter had begun to cry uncontrollably during this time, that he was hugging her the entire time, trying to calm her and contain her fear. Eventually, she told her father she needed to use the bathroom. Amjad was not convinced that they would allow access to a bathroom, but got out of his car to inquire as his daughter's crying was escalating, and he could tell she was in considerable discomfort. Amjad told Yoad that he waved down a settler soldier, telling him, "My daughter needs a bathroom." Instead of responding to him, the soldiers ran towards him with their weapons raised. And he said, "I raised my hands towards the sky and shouted at them, 'She wants a bathroom. Please let me pass.'" The settler soldiers yelled, "Get back in your car. Get back. Get in the car. Tell your daughter to piss herself in the car." All the while, his daughter continued to cry, "Baba, I need a bathroom." Amjad recalled getting back in his car, hugging his daughter, and with a trembling voice telling her, "Do it here, Baba. Do it quietly here in the car." He remembered how at that moment his daughter's screaming stopped as the smell of urine spread in the car. Amjad looked at his daughter and found her shedding silent tears. He hugged her as he drove them home, and as he looked at the checkpoint gate, he remembered the cheerful song of his daughter at the beginning of the day, "Bouncy, bouncy over the wall. We're not you, ball," after which he immediately felt a ball stuck in his throat. Yoad remembered how Amjad finished describing the incident and witnessed tears flowing down his cheeks for the first time. She remembered tears rolling down her cheeks as well as she became aware of a wheal in her own throat. This case is important for many reasons, not the least of which is the distilling of the banality of violence enacted daily on Palestinians, whether patients or clinicians. And again, this is why I led with what I did and asked us to hold that in mind. Yoad tells us that Amjad's treatment was one that she will never forget in her life. She confides in us, saying, "I often remember Amjad. He guides me professionally and privately. It changed me in the way that I practice." The effect of this case on Yoad is what I focus on here and in our book. It encapsulates the condition of the Palestinian as an extension into the clinical and the clinical into the personal and the social. But more specifically, it allows us an opportunity to acknowledge how Palestinian clinicians refuse to erase the signs of Zionist settler colonialism embodied in the clinical space, both in the therapist and the patient, no matter the systemic pressure or the demands from supervisors or from international organizations, for example, to reduce them into primarily behavioral beings with no depth and interiority. In a depoliticized condition, one might say that Amjad's physiological symptoms are experienced physically without any medical basis. The Israeli supervisor identifies the symptom as a conversion symptom, as a symptom of an anxiety disorder. She sees him as primarily as a resistant patient who refuses to speak, to articulate thoughts, or to open up and be honest. We call this ideological misattunement that saturates psychoanalytic thought, analysis, and treatment. An inability to identify processes precisely because the analyst or clinician is implicated by and imbricated in the ideological matrix in which the patient is also entangled. This exemplifies psychoanalytic innocence. To bring it back to our talk today and to what is happening in real time in Palestine, I would especially like to draw our attention to how liberal and humanistic psychoanalysis maintains this ideological naturalization and misattunement, remaining complicit through forms of oppression by seeking to graft a universalized, healthy adaptability onto colonial and racialized subjects whose humanity and psychic interiority are negated. In a liberalized version of psychoanalytic theory, these colonial subjects are only able to access empathy when they occupy the position of victim and surrender their rights to experience political and material realities in full alignment with their experience and social context, or in terms of their will to live and liberate themselves. Yoad's supervisor attempts to mobilize psychoanalytic innocence. And like all of the Palestinian clinicians alongside whom we learned, Yoad was a willful subject engaging in the politics of refusal, a Palestinian clinician unwilling to succumb to the colonial violence inflicted on her as a clinician, nor on her patient Amjad, a Palestinian clinician insisting on indigenous Palestinian presence, even in the face of settler aggression that insist on erasing the native. To the Israeli settler, in this case a supervisor, Amjad's silence could only be a defense, a deflection from confronting the unconscious. Without attending to the structural and material realities of his world as a Palestinian, she reads his symptoms as just nerves, anxiety that can be medicated. If we were to collude with psychoanalytic innocence, we might mistake this supervisor's racist and colonial aggression as a disaggregated singular act of random violence, rather than an essential part of a coordinated system of violence, oppression, and erasure perpetrated by the settler state of Israel, here manifesting in the supervisory space. In this way, Yoad also alerts us to the importance of the Palestinian body, individually and collectively, as a site of violence, as well as a site of resistance and sociability. The somatization, for example, feeling the ball in the throat, is not a symptom of a disorder. Rather, it's a symptom of functioning within material reality that stops up the flow of the unconscious, the social, and the intersubjective. His symptom, confronted and read through the context of Palestinian intersubjectivity, does not only direct us to the settler colonial condition, but also makes us consider how the occupation may manifest itself, perhaps can only manifest itself within the context of Palestinian masculinity here, for example, through somatization. Otherwise, it might be dismissed or minimalized. My own additional reading as a clinician is that the supervisor felt compelled to stop Amjad from speaking, lest he disclose the realities of violence being done to him by the Israeli state with which she was so identified. Indeed, there's no place for a Palestine-speaking subject in the settler colonial regime. The suffocating ball itself is not the only symptom, something which Yoad recognized as a Palestinian colonial subject clinician. In this way, the symptoms were hyper-visible to her, to Yoad, but the symptoms were illegible to the ideologically misattuned Israeli supervisor. The symptom of silence and empty speech signified the loss of the ability to speak deeply in Yoad's language, to articulate meaning, as well as a blockage to affectively express the damage inflicted on the interior self by the daily violence of occupation. We can then understand Yoad's decision to continue working with him, despite her supervisor indicating she shouldn't, as a liberatory and ethical imperative that most movingly disrupts the settlers' insistence on futurity. In making this decision, Yoad demonstrates that she saw his symptoms as a checkpoint, a hajiz, a barrier, just as he did, just as we do in the everyday life of Palestinians, just as all our clinician colleagues tell us. In this way, Yoad, as well as her patients, actively disrupt settler colonial logic and insist on indigenous presence, life-making. Just a couple final words before I wrap up. It's important to note that the central point of our book is how Palestinian clinicians and Palestinians themselves not only work to resist settler colonial hegemony, but how their work is an affirmation of Palestinian life and lives. The psychic political economy of life defies being objectified as victim. It struggles to maintain, even though at times tragic, desperate, and to some heroic ways, dignity, commitment, and responsibility to themselves as individuals and communities. We build on the insights of Nadira Shalhoub-Kavarkian about how psychic political power emanating from, quote, sites of death generate a collective psychosocial embodiment of everyday resistance. More specifically, we identify how the psychosocial practices of Palestinians through the experiences, through psychoanalysis and the technique of clinicians, affirm the centrality of the embodied psyche, al-nafs, as the primary site for Palestinian life, willfulness, and resistance. Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.